My name is Clara Whitmore. I'm 72, and lately I've come to think of my life less as a sequence of events and more as the slow layering of silence. It's a quiet that doesn't come all at once, but creeps in through the cracks, after the last dinner plate is put away, after the last door closes behind someone who won't be coming back. The house I live in has stood for nearly 50 years, a modest Victorian with creaky stairs and a garden that still tries its best each spring. I sometimes catch myself tracing the worn path between the kitchen and the living room, as if retracing some memory that refuses to fade. This place remembers far more than I do. The echoes of old conversations still linger in the corners, soft and shapeless, and the scent of varnish Tom used on the banister sometimes surprises me, even though he's been gone nearly 15 years now. We built our life here in pieces, weekend by weekend, paycheck by paycheck. Tom was never one for grand gestures. He showed his love through repairs, the steady thud of his boots on the porch each evening, the quiet act of filling my car's tank without being asked. I used to fall asleep to the sound of him snoring beside me, never knowing how much I'd miss even that. When he fell ill, it felt like the foundation cracked beneath my feet. But we didn't talk about dying then. We talked about spring, about replacing the kitchen window, about the tomatoes we'd plant when he got better. But of course, the tomatoes never went in. He passed quietly on a windy morning just as the leaves began to change. I remember the sky more than anything, how bright it was, how wrong it felt. Ethan was already grown by then, married, successful, always in motion. He arrived at the funeral like a guest late to a show, suit pressed, eyes distant. He stood beside me, hands clasped, and said all the right things. But his grief was tight-lipped and efficient, like everything else in his life. I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that Tom's death might draw us closer, that shared loss could soften something between us. Instead, he drifted farther, as if sorrow had hardened him in ways I couldn't reach. The visits grew shorter. The calls turned into texts. He stopped asking about the garden. I stopped offering. I didn't expect anything different. Not really, but it still surprised me how quickly a child can become a stranger when love no longer runs both ways. There's a kind of ache that settles in your chest when you realize the person you gave everything to now sees you as someone peripheral, an occasional obligation, a background character in a life too busy for roots. And yet not every thread came loose. There was Noah, my grandson, Ethan's son from his first marriage, a quiet boy who somehow grew into a thoughtful man without anyone noticing. He came often, unannounced but always welcome, bringing books or questions or that gentle energy I've come to associate with spring mornings. He's the one who insisted I learn to use a smartphone, then taught me how to email, how to video call, even how to start a blog. "You've got stories," he said once, sipping tea at my kitchen table. "Why let them die with you?" So I began writing, not because I thought anyone would read it, but because I needed to remember who I'd been. Asterisk Balcony Botanica. That's what I called it. A blog about container gardening mostly, but also about loss and hope and patience. About things that grow where they're not supposed to. The audience came slowly. Other women mostly, who had lost people, or time, or parts of themselves. We shared seed tips and grief in the same breath. It was enough. Noah was the one who told me about the wedding. He didn't lead with it. He spoke of his coursework first, the lab work, the professors, but I could sense it in his hesitation, the way he refilled my tea before finishing his sentence. "Dad's getting married," he said finally, eyes on the steam rising between us. I felt the words settle somewhere behind my ribs, sharp but not entirely unexpected. I didn't ask who, not at first. It didn't matter. Her name was Vanessa. She worked in dentistry, confident, poised, a woman who knew how to fill a room, apparently. She had a teenage daughter. They were, as Noah put it, a package deal. He didn't say much more, but I could hear the caution in his voice, that measured pause between each thought. He wasn't trying to sway me, only to prepare me. I asked if Ethan was happy. He said, "He says he is," in the kind of voice that meant he wasn't sure if that counted. There was talk of a wedding, not just a ceremony, but an event. Maple Crest Lodge, the kind of place with marble staircases and imported linens. I remembered it from years ago. Tom had taken me there for our 25th anniversary. We couldn't afford the menu, but we split dessert and danced anyway. It had felt extravagant then. Now, it felt like a stage, and I already knew what part they'd want me to play. I didn't say anything to Noah that day. I only nodded and offered more tea. But in my chest, something heavy shifted. Not dread exactly, something quieter, a kind of preemptive grief. The call from Ethan came the next evening. His voice was polished, rehearsed. He asked about my knees, about the hydrangeas, about the blog. He spoke of Vanessa with glowing generalities, how gracious she was, how much I'd like her, how natural she'd become in his life. I listened, I always do. When he paused, I filled the space he was trying to soften. "How much are you needing?" I asked, without irony, without warmth. There was a pause, short but enough, and then a number. It wasn't obscene, just significant enough to leave a mark, enough to test the line between generosity and being used. I told him I would help. And in that moment, I heard relief, not gratitude on the other end of the line. I agreed, not because I believed in their marriage, or because I thought Vanessa would make him whole again. Not because I had savings to spare or dreams to burn. I agreed because there was still a part of me, small, stubborn, that wanted to believe saying yes might lead to something better. That offering once again would be enough to matter. We mothers are trained to give until we disappear, to measure our worth in what we offer rather than what we're offered in return. I didn't expect anything back, but I hoped, quietly, uselessly, that this time might be different. After Ethan's call ended, I sat motionless, the phone still warm in my hand, though I'd long since stopped hearing his voice. The sun had shifted across the living room window, casting light on the dust motes floating lazily above the mantel, as if even time itself had slowed down to watch me think. The old clock above the fireplace ticked in steady rhythm, unfazed by what had just occurred. Tom had fixed that clock a dozen times over the years, and each time he declared it might be the last, though it never was. It just kept ticking no matter who left. I suppose I had expected to feel something decisive after agreeing to fund the wedding, a sense of relief maybe, or some flicker of inclusion. Instead, the feeling that settled over me was hollow, like I'd opened a window expecting fresh air and received only stillness. I told myself I did it because I wanted to support my son, to reconnect with what little remained of our closeness. But the truth, quiet and persistent, whispered otherwise. I didn't know how to say no to him. I mailed the check the next morning, folded neatly in a cream-colored envelope along with a note written in my best cursive that simply read, "I hope it's beautiful." Then I tucked the transaction out of my thoughts and tried to return to my days as they had been, simple, structured, and filled with the gentle duties of a solitary life. But the calls started coming more frequently after that. Not long chats, not the kind that let memories stretch out and breathe, but short, targeted updates. Ethan would speak quickly about caterers and floral arrangements, color themes and menu adjustments. His voice carried the tone of a man reciting tasks, not sharing joy. Vanessa, he said, wanted everything perfect. Classic with a modern touch was how he described her vision. I nodded into the phone, even though he couldn't see me. I met Vanessa for the first time 2 weeks later when Ethan brought her to the house. She rang the bell promptly at 2, and when I opened the door, I saw a woman both immaculately styled and calculatingly gracious. Her smile was polite, not warm, and she greeted me with the kind of poised civility one might offer a client's mother. She was wearing a pale cream blouse tucked into fitted trousers, her perfume light but noticeable, her tone rehearsed. As she stepped inside, she glanced around the house, and I had the impression she was silently taking inventory, not just of objects, but of my relevance. We sat in the sunroom where she commented on my orchids and complimented the antique tea set on the tray. Her eyes lingered just a second too long on the silver trim, and I knew exactly what she was measuring. She spoke about the wedding in fluent bullet points, guest counts, table shapes, lighting options. Ethan said little, just nodded at intervals, his hands clasped between his knees. I listened, sipped tea, and nodded when it seemed appropriate. When I asked if there was anything I could do to help, Vanessa's response was immediate. "Oh, it's all handled, truly. Your support is more than enough." Her smile was bright, her words too smooth. It was the kind of dismissal so subtle you almost missed it. I smiled in return and said nothing more. After they left, I sat alone in the same sunroom, the half-empty teapot still warm. I looked out at the garden, Tom's garden, once mine, now mostly untended, and wondered when I had become a guest in my own life. Noah stopped by the following week with a bag of groceries and a new pair of gardening gloves. He didn't ask about the wedding directly, but I knew he was circling the subject. I told him the roses were struggling this year, and he said it was probably the late frost. We worked side by side in silence for a while, and I realized it was the most comfortable I'd felt all week. A few days later, the invitation arrived. Heavy cardstock, raised lettering, thick with the scent of perfume and formality. Ethan and Vanessa requested the honor of my presence. The wording was distant, impersonal, no mention of family, no warmth in the phrasing. I set the envelope on the table and stared at it for several minutes before opening it. The date was set for early summer. The venue, Maple Crest Lodge, a lakeside estate known for weddings that photographed well. There was no note, no suggestion of a toast or a seat at the head table. Just a list of expectations: arrival time, dress code, RSVP deadline. The instructions about attire were oddly specific: no navy, no black. Preferred colors: silver or pale lavender. Please avoid loud patterns, the card advised. Subtle elegance appreciated. I reread that line 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wasn't sure what version of me they were hoping would show up. That night, I pulled out my small collection of formal wear. Most of it was years old, bought during the era when events still had meaning for me. Nothing I owned fit the palette, and I knew better than to try to stretch the rules, so I ordered a new dress: lavender, knee-length, high-collar, discreet. When it arrived, I stood in front of the mirror and studied my reflection. It wasn't a bad dress. It just didn't feel like mine. It felt like a uniform. Ethan called again a few days later to confirm that the car service had been arranged for me. He told me the rehearsal dinner would be limited to the inner circle, but that I would have a wonderful seat for the ceremony. Vanessa has everything mapped out, he said, his voice tight with something I couldn't name. I told him I looked forward to it. He thanked me again, he always did, but his thank yous never came with follow-ups. After the call, I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing out my teacup, and thought about how strange it was to feel like a guest in a moment I'd paid to make possible. I told myself I would show up, I would smile, I would wear the dress and follow the seating chart. But somewhere deep inside, something had started to unravel. A small knot of doubt tightening in my chest. I didn't know it yet, but this wouldn't just be another wedding. It would be the moment the story changed. The morning of the wedding dawned quietly, without ceremony or celebration, and I rose long before my alarm, not from excitement, but from a persistent restlessness that had followed me through the night like a shadow. The house, normally my shelter, seemed distant, its silence echoing the truth I had tried to ignore. This day wasn't mine to be part of. As I prepared, my hands moved through familiar motions, slipping into the lavender dress Vanessa had chosen, fastening the silver brooch from my mother, a detail she hadn't approved but which I wore anyway, not in defiance, but in subtle defense of the woman I still was beneath all the roles and expectations placed upon me. The envelope with the wedding gift lay on the table beside a half-empty teacup, tied with a silver ribbon to match the decor they had so carefully controlled. I took one last glance at the house that held decades of memories before stepping into the waiting car. The driver offered a polite nod, and we drove in silence through streets that had once held joy and familiarity, now passing like relics in a museum. Schoolyards, parks, and cafes, all bearing the faint fingerprints of a life that used to be shared but no longer held space for me. When we arrived at Maple Crest, the estate looked like it had been plucked from a bridal catalog. Every hedge trimmed, every window glistening, every stone in place. A young woman with a clipboard greeted me by name and escorted me to a guest room overlooking the lake. Beautiful but sterile, a space meant to impress rather than welcome. A card on the vanity read Mother of the Groom, but it might as well have said, "Careful, do not disturb the narrative." I asked if Ethan might stop in before the ceremony, but the answer came with a practiced smile. He was with the groomsmen, preparing. I waited by the window, watching guests arrive in sleek suits and pastel dresses, laughing and sipping champagne before noon, their joy effortless, untouched by any concern for who had or hadn't arrived. No one looked up. No one asked for me. When a staff member finally knocked, I followed her down through halls that echoed with polished anticipation to the terrace where the ceremony would unfold. The flowers were arranged with precision, the chairs aligned in perfect arcs, and the arch framed the lake in a way that seemed as rehearsed as the vows to come. Ethan appeared first, elegant in a tailored suit, composed but unreadable. When our eyes met, I smiled. He nodded back, brief and distant, before looking away. Then Vanessa made her entrance, radiant in her crystal-trimmed gown, her posture commanding but cool, and in the stillness between us, I recognized that her gaze would not drift toward me even once. Her world, in that moment, included only the man waiting at the altar and the audience that validated her choices. The vows were spoken like lines in a play, not faltering, not trembling, just polished. The kiss followed exactly as planned, framed by music and applause, and I clapped along because to do otherwise would draw the kind of attention I had clearly not been invited to receive. During cocktail hour, I found a quiet space under the trees, far enough to be invisible but close enough to observe. A few guests approached with vague politeness, asking who I was, blinking in surprise when I said I was Ethan's mother, before offering some brief nicety and drifting back into their safer circles. Dinner brought no more welcome than the ceremony had. I was seated at a table tucked near the kitchen, sharing space with people I barely knew, exchanging generic pleasantries about the food and weather, while the head table glowed under special lighting, filled with Vanessa's family and Ethan's curated circle. One toast followed another. Vanessa's father, her sister, Ethan's college friend, all speaking warmly of the couple's journey, their shared dreams, their destined happiness. Not once was I mentioned. Not once did a voice acknowledge my role in the life that brought Ethan to this moment. When dessert ended and dancing began, I slipped away once more, drawn back to the quiet of the terrace where only hours before they had spoken their vows beneath the arch. The petals had begun to sag slightly under the evening air, but the scene still shimmered with intention. I stood by the railing, watching the lights on the lake ripple with the breeze, feeling not so much abandoned as erased, smoothed over, like a detail that didn't fit the final vision. The sound of heels broke the silence behind me, sharp, steady, deliberate. I knew without turning who it was. Vanessa stood beside me, her dress now catching the light in hard reflections, her face impassive. She didn't speak right away, didn't offer a smile or nod, just looked at me with something colder than indifference. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't just excluded, I was being removed, rewritten, rendered unnecessary. She didn't need to say anything because the silence between us told me all I needed to know. In her eyes, I wasn't a mother. I was a relic of a past she didn't want attached to her future. I looked out toward the lake one last time, then back at the celebration behind us, and knew that from this moment on, I would no longer ask to be part of someone else's story. I would begin writing my own. I wasn't just stepping away from the wedding that night. I was stepping away from a version of myself that had waited too long to be seen, had given too much without asking for space in return. That silence between us became the closing chapter of a role I no longer wished to perform. I called a cab, but the wait was long, so I stood near the hedge, half in shadow, watching as laughter drifted from open windows and chandeliers sparkled through glass like unreachable galaxies. I kept replaying the moment on the terrace, her eyes meeting mine not with hostility but with indifference, a wordless declaration that I was neither threat nor ally, merely irrelevant. Ethan hadn't come looking for me, hadn't noticed I'd slipped away, and that hurt more than Vanessa's silence or her carefully measured contempt. I sat at the edge of the bed, the envelope with my wedding gift still in my purse, untouched, unopened, and somehow heavier than it had been that morning. I went to bed with the window open, letting the breeze carry away the last echoes of music and vows, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to keep trying to be someone I was not, just to be loved by people who never saw me clearly to begin with. When the car finally pulled up, I gave the driver my address and sat back in the seat, not crying, not fuming, just tracing the pattern of my thoughts as they unraveled and rewove into something stronger than grief. What struck me most wasn't the anger or the humiliation, but the sudden clarity that I had spent so many years making myself smaller to fit into spaces that had no room for me in the first place. Outside, the evening air was cooler than I expected, and the stars were out, glittering like they knew a secret I had only just begun to understand. Eventually, I took the gift and quietly left the room, navigating the hallways without direction, just the ache in my chest steering me away from the glow of the reception. By the time we reached my street, I felt no need to explain my early return, no urgency to defend my absence. The house greeted me the way it always had, with silence, yes, but not judgment. And as I stepped through the door, I realized the only apology owed that night was the one I would never receive. I poured myself a glass of water, placed the envelope on the table, and stared at it like it might vanish if I just waited long enough. But it didn't vanish, and neither did the truth. I had tried again and again to earn a seat at a table that was never meant for me, so I put the envelope away, not out of resentment, but because I finally understood that love wasn't something that should require this much pain to prove. When I returned to my room, the noise of the celebration still echoed faintly through the corridor, a muffled reminder that joy was being rationed and I had not received my share. The celebration continued without a hitch, the music rising and falling like a tide I could no longer swim in. Ethan appeared once more in my mind's eye, standing at the altar with his eyes searching not for me, but for his place in a life shaped by someone else's priorities. I no longer felt angry with him, only tired. Tired of making excuses, tired of shrinking, tired of rehearsing conversations in my mind where I ask to be seen and still end up invisible. I woke the next morning with the sun already rising through the curtains, casting long golden stripes across the floor. For a few moments I lay there, eyes open, watching the dust swirl in the light. I expected to feel regret, or at least sorrow, but I felt neither. What I felt was something cleaner, quieter, an emptying out of something heavy. I made myself tea, sat in my chair by the window, and watched the world move as if nothing monumental had happened. And perhaps for most people, nothing had. That's the thing about becoming invisible. You can vanish in plain sight, and not a single person notices you're gone. That day, I turned off my phone. I needed silence, not the hollow kind that comes from neglect, but the deliberate kind that allows a person to hear herself again. I let the house breathe. I didn't clean up the dishes. I didn't make the bed. I simply let myself exist, untethered from expectation. I didn't know what Ethan and Vanessa were doing, opening gifts, perhaps, or boarding a plane to somewhere beautiful and far away. I didn't care to know. The only thing I was sure of was that, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for a phone call that wouldn't come. That afternoon, I found myself pulling out an old photo album from the bottom drawer of the cabinet, not to reminisce with longing, but to remember the version of me that once had dreams outside of motherhood. There I was, in faded pictures beside Alfred, beside baby Ethan, young, full of ideas, with laughter that hadn't yet been traded for silence. And as I closed the album, I made a quiet vow to find that woman again, in small ways, on my own terms. That night, as I brushed my hair before bed, I caught my own gaze in the mirror, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't look away. There was no shame left to avert, only a quiet recognition of the woman I had always been and the peace that comes when you finally stop waiting for someone else to name your worth. I didn't know what would come next, not in the grand sense of destiny, but in the quiet, practical steps of reclaiming my days. Yet even without a plan, I felt ready, as if simply saying no to one version of myself made space for another to take shape. The silence of my house, once oppressive, now felt like a canvas, blank, vast, and waiting. Not for noise or people to fill it, but for intention. I could finally imagine mornings defined by choice, not obligation. The day after the wedding, I allowed myself to move slowly. There was no urgency, no plans, no demands from anyone. I woke up late, the kind of late that feels like the body's quiet rebellion against years of forced discipline. The light was already pouring in through the bedroom curtains, warm and honest, exposing everything and hiding nothing. I sat at the edge of the bed, my feet brushing the soft rug, and took in the stillness of my home. It felt like something had shifted, not just in the world outside, but inside of me. The silence no longer felt hollow, it felt earned. I made breakfast without thought, stirring oatmeal on the stove and slicing bananas with a kind of deliberate peace. My phone buzzed once, then again, and then went quiet. I didn't reach for it. I wasn't ready. The emotional weight of the night before still lingered like steam on a mirror, visible only if you paid attention, easy to wipe away but slow to forget. Eventually, I turned it on and watched the notifications flood in. Voicemails, texts, one after another. Most were from Ethan. A few came from numbers I didn't recognize. One was from Keith. That was the only one I opened. He had written, "Are you okay? Call me when you're ready. I'm here." That was all. No panic, no pressure, just presence. I stared at that message longer than I should have, my hand resting gently over my heart, as if to absorb his words not just through my eyes, but through the part of me that still longed for softness. When I finally listened to Ethan's messages, I did so with the kettle boiling behind me and the wind tapping gently at the kitchen window. His voice, usually polished and self-assured, was fraught with tension. In one message, he apologized. Sort of. In another, he sounded angry, asking how I could leave so early and put them in an awkward position. But the last one made it clear what had truly unsettled him. "Mom, there's a problem with the venue. They say the final payment hasn't gone through. They said you were covering it. Please call back. We need to sort this out." Need. That word again. Not love, not want. Need. I'd spent my life responding to that word like it was a call to arms, an alarm bell I couldn't ignore. But this time I let it ring. I turned the kettle off, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window. The clouds were gathering overhead, thick and low, the kind of sky that promised rain but didn't rush it. I sipped my tea slowly, allowing every thought to come and go without resistance. I wasn't angry, not exactly. It was something colder, quieter, like the final breath before a door closes for good. The knock came mid-morning, firm and familiar. I didn't need to ask who it was. I opened the door, and there stood Ethan, disheveled, tense, eyes darting behind me like he expected to see an army waiting. He stepped inside without asking. He always did that, as if the house were still his, as if I still owed him entry. He launched into his concern like a script rehearsed too many times. The venue was threatening legal action. The bill was overdue, the planners were calling constantly, and Jenny was beside herself with anxiety. He said all this without once asking how I was. When I finally spoke, I did so calmly, with the steadiness I'd found during the quiet hours before. I reminded him that I had offered to pay under the assumption that I was a welcome guest. That assumption clearly had been incorrect. His reaction was sharp. He accused me of sabotaging the wedding, of being petty, of holding a grudge. I didn't flinch. I'd lived long enough to know when someone's accusations are a projection of their own guilt. He pleaded. He reasoned. He circled back to the same refrain. It's not just about us. It's about how this will look. The community, the investors, our image. I listened, but I didn't bend. I told him I would not be paying the remainder. That what happened at that wedding was not something I would endorse, financially or emotionally. His face darkened. He muttered something about Jenny being right, that I was cold, controlling, manipulative. I stood still, arms crossed lightly over my chest, and let him finish. Then I said, "If being respected means I'm cold, so be it. If setting a boundary means I'm controlling, I accept that. And if not giving you more money makes me manipulative, then I've been all of those things far too late." He left in a storm of frustration, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the window panes. I didn't stop him. I didn't chase. I didn't call after him with reminders of all the ways I'd supported him through the years. I didn't need to. I no longer believed that listing my sacrifices would justify my worth. The people who needed that list had already chosen not to see it. The next morning, a letter came in the mail from the venue, a formal notice stamped and sealed requesting immediate payment or legal action would begin. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in my desk drawer. Then I called my attorney, a quiet man named Howard who had managed my affairs since Alfred passed. We scheduled a meeting for the following Monday. It was time to update my will, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I didn't expect the quiet that followed Ethan's outburst to feel so comforting. As I stood in the kitchen, sipping tea that had long gone lukewarm, something inside me settled. It wasn't peace exactly, but a clarity I hadn't felt in years. For so long, I had been moving through my life like a guest in my own home, tidying up others' messes, patching holes in strained relationships, trying to hold things together for a family that no longer looked back at me when I spoke. That day, I realized I had finally stopped reaching. The silence no longer frightened me. It felt earned. The very next morning, I called Howard Miller, our family lawyer and one of the few people who'd known me as more than just Ethan's mother or Alfred's widow. He'd been by our side through decades: home purchases, trusts, Alfred's will, even Ethan's college financial aid paperwork. When I told him I needed to amend my will, his voice didn't flinch, only asked for a time to meet. I gathered every receipt, wire confirmation, and invoice I had from the wedding expenses, placed them in a thick envelope, and took a bus into town. Sitting across from Howard, I didn't dress the moment in drama. I spoke plainly. I told him that my son had allowed his wife to humiliate me publicly, and I would no longer allow guilt or loyalty to guide my decisions. "I'd like to remove Ethan from the will," I said. "Everything will go to Keith." He didn't blink. "Are you certain?" he asked, not judgmental, but thoughtful. "Yes," I said, more certain than I'd ever been about anything. It wasn't out of anger, it was out of clarity. We completed the paperwork with quiet precision. There were no tears, no hesitation. Howard passed me a pen, and as I signed, I thought of how often I'd used that same hand to write checks for Ethan, notes of encouragement, letters of apology I never should have had to write. This time, I was signing for myself. When it was done, Howard gave me a look that felt like kindness and said, "You're taking care of yourself. That's allowed." Afterward, I walked to the nearby park and found a familiar bench under a flowering dogwood tree. It was a place Alfred and I used to sit in the spring. As I watched a pair of children chasing each other down the path, I let myself miss him, not with the sharpness of grief, but with the soft ache of memory. He would have seen through Jenny from the start. He would have told me not to bend myself backward, trying to be accepted where I wasn't wanted. Back at home, I found myself cleaning again, not for tidiness, but for clarity. I went through drawers, photo boxes, even dusty keepsakes I hadn't touched in years. I found an old letter from Ethan when he was in college, thanking me for sending soup packets and warm socks. The words felt almost foreign now. I kept the letter, not to dwell on what was lost, but to remind myself that there had been something real once, even if it was now gone. Then, as expected, Jenny showed up. No call, no text, just her expensive shoes on my porch and that smile that never reached her eyes. "I want to make things right," she said, carefully rehearsed, every word chosen, but her tone shifted soon enough. She spoke of stress, of reputation, of how hard Ethan had been taking the fallout. Finally, she asked if I would consider paying the remaining balance on the wedding. I declined, without drama, without justification. Just no. She narrowed her eyes, trying to mask the flash of resentment. "You're choosing to hold a grudge," she said. "You're hurting your own family." But it wasn't a grudge. It was a decision, a clear, firm one. I told her we had nothing else to discuss. She left, not with grace, but with a muttered insult under her breath, something about bitterness and old women with too much time. That night, I didn't dwell. I didn't wonder if I'd been too harsh. I didn't relive the conversation in my head until sleep found me. I made myself a small supper, pulled an old book off the shelf, one Alfred had always loved, and read until the pages blurred. Then I went to bed and slept soundly, as if my body knew I had finally stopped sacrificing myself to maintain peace that never truly existed. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch before sunrise. The sky was still a pale gray, the air cool on my skin, and the hush of the early hour reminded me of mornings from my nursing days. Oh, I stood there for a long time, wrapped in a shawl, watching the neighborhood slowly wake. Something in me had shifted permanently. I was no longer waiting to be invited into someone else's life. I wasn't trying to be understood by people who only saw me when they needed something. I had stopped asking for a seat at their table, and in that stillness, I realized I didn't want a seat anymore. I wanted peace, and I had finally given myself permission to claim it. The morning after Jenny's outburst arrived with a silence that felt oddly deliberate, as if even the air in my home had taken a step back. I moved slowly through my routine, not out of fatigue, but because everything I did seemed weighted with a new awareness. There was no going back to before. The mask Jenny had worn for months had finally cracked, and Ethan's silence had spoken louder than anything he could have said. My place in their carefully curated lives had always been conditional, and now it. I didn't want to sit with the feeling, so I walked. No destination, just a quiet urge to move. My feet led me through familiar streets, past the bakery that once sold my favorite apple tarts, the bookstore that had become a gift shop, and finally to the library. Keith was there, hunched over his laptop, scribbling notes in a worn spiral. He looked up and smiled as if he'd been waiting for me, like my arrival confirmed something he hadn't been sure of. We didn't speak much at first, but when he did, it wasn't to ask questions or offer advice. He simply said he understood, that he'd already told Ethan this was bound to happen. "You're not the villain here, Grandma," he said, and those words settled inside me like a weight that balanced rather than burdened. I didn't correct him. He saw what I saw, what I'd been refusing to name. I was no longer a part of Ethan's real life. I was a transaction, dressed up in family titles and fading memories. Later that day, I received a letter. Ethan's handwriting was unmistakable. Tight, slightly slanted, almost performative. The letter was a delicate dance of apologies without ownership, justifications dressed as concern, and a plea to reconsider for everyone's sake. He wanted me to pay, not because it was right, but because it would make the embarrassment disappear. I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer with the dish towels, somewhere forgettable. The next morning, I visited my attorney, Howard Miller. We finalized the updates to my will. Keith would receive everything. No special clauses for Ethan or Jenny, no explanations. Howard asked if I was sure, and I didn't hesitate. I handed him a folder containing receipts, correspondence, and screenshots. Every detail of the wedding arrangements I had contributed to. There was no need for drama, just closure. Legal, final, unemotional. On the way home, I wandered into a small vintage shop I'd passed dozens of times. Something about the quiet arrangement of vases and old books pulled me in. I found a glass teardrop-shaped vase that reminded me of something my mother used to own. I bought it without thinking much, carried it home and placed it on my windowsill. It caught the light in a way that made the whole room feel more still, more mine. The following week, I resumed my volunteering at the library. I had joined a digital skills group for seniors a few months prior, and now I helped lead it. Showing others how to email, shop online, and video call their grandchildren brought me a purpose I hadn't expected. These weren't just lessons, they were lifelines. The people who came were like me in so many quiet ways, carrying unspoken stories of loss, pride, and reinvention. Some of them began opening up in small moments about estranged children, birthdays that came and went unnoticed, and the small victories of learning something new. I never told them my full story, but I think they sensed it, that I had chosen to walk away not because it was easy, but because I finally understood that peace sometimes lives on the other side of letting go. At home, I rearranged the dining room and turned it into a workspace for my blog. With Keith's help, I updated the design and added a new section focused on reclaiming one's identity later in life. To my surprise, the response was immediate. Women my age reached out, saying my words gave voice to thoughts they didn't know how to express. The blog became more than a pastime. It became a space where women like me realized they were allowed to take up space, to matter again. By the time the sun dipped below the rooftops that evening, I sat with a cup of tea and looked around at the quiet, light-filled space I now called home. There were no thank you notes from Ethan, no calls from Jenny, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to wait for one. I had stopped asking for a seat at a table where I was never truly welcome. That night, as the moon rose and shadows lengthened across the hardwood floors, I whispered a quiet thank you. To myself, to the journey, to the strength that had always been there but had waited decades to emerge. I had crossed a threshold not into revenge or bitterness, but into something far more liberating, a life on my own terms, and that, more than any apology, was what I truly needed. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the knock came, firm, deliberate, not like the hesitant ones from neighbors or the polite taps from delivery men. I stood still for a moment, letting the kettle hiss behind me while I glanced toward the door, already knowing who it would be. Something in my chest tightened, that old tension rising like steam in my throat. When I opened the door, Jenny was there, standing like a statue in pressed slacks and a raincoat too formal for the weather. Her face was perfectly painted, but I noticed the clench in her jaw, the slight twitch in her fingers wrapped around the handle of her purse. She didn't ask if she could come in. She just said, "We need to talk," and stepped past me like this was still her stage to perform on. I didn't stop her. I closed the door quietly behind her and walked to the chair opposite the one she always chose, next to the fireplace, where the old clock ticked steadily, marking time we couldn't rewind. She started with niceties, the kind that feel rehearsed and empty. Comments about how the garden looked, how Keith mentioned I was doing well, as if those words could mask the reason she was here. I let her speak. I had learned, finally, that silence was a more powerful mirror than confrontation. Eventually, she leaned forward, her tone dropping into the familiar blend of performative concern and subtle pressure. She talked about the bills from Hillcrest and how things had spiraled a little beyond budget. She tried to paint it as a shared inconvenience, as if I too had mistakenly overbooked a florist or a photographer. Her words curled around the truth without touching it. She didn't say, "You promised," or "You owe us," but her meaning was clear. Gavin had failed to bring me around, and now it was her turn. I sat straighter in my chair. "There won't be any further payment," I said, calmly, evenly. No anger, no apology, just the truth. I paid for a wedding where I would be a guest, not a ghost. Her expression didn't crack at first, but I watched her composure begin to tremble, like frost melting from glass. She tried indignation, said I was holding a grudge, punishing them, that I didn't understand how serious the situation was. When I didn't respond the way she expected, she pivoted again, softening her voice, suggesting we start over, claiming she wanted a healthy relationship for Gavin's sake. It was a performance I'd seen many times. I didn't fault her for trying, but I no longer felt compelled to play my part. "No, Jenny," I said. "A relationship built on guilt isn't healthy. It's a debt collection." She stood quickly then, the chair scraping against the wood floor. Her voice sharpened as she hurled accusations I'd long expected. Manipulative, controlling, selfish. She said Keith would suffer if this drove a wedge between us, and I realized then that she still didn't understand him. Keith had grown into a man who saw through theatrics. He had already made his choice, not between me and his father, but between decency and deceit. Jenny left the house with a dramatic flourish, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames. I didn't chase after her. I didn't shout or cry. I simply poured the tea that had gone cold and stood by the window, watching the steam rise and vanish like breath on a winter morning. A week later, a thick envelope from Hillcrest's legal department arrived. The language was stiff, precise, designed to intimidate. They claimed I had agreed to pay the full sum. They threatened legal action. I slid the letter across my dining table to Howard when he visited that evening. He skimmed it with practiced eyes, then said plainly, "They have no case. You didn't sign anything. Let them bark." In the days that followed, I returned to my writing. I posted a piece titled "The Price of Presence," where I reflected on how much women like me were expected to give without question, and how little we were granted in return. The piece struck a chord. My inbox flooded with messages from women, some older, some my age, some much younger, who shared their own stories of being erased from events they had paid for, families they had held together. The resonance reminded me I was not alone. There was a quiet army of us, scattered across generations and towns, learning in our own ways how to reclaim our voices. Keith came by often during that time. We didn't talk about Jenny or Gavin. He helped me rearrange the living room one weekend, insisting the light would fall better on my plants. One evening, as we sat watching the shadows stretch across the balcony, he said softly, "I think you've taught me more by saying no than you ever did saying yes." That stayed with me longer than anything Jenny had said. I realized that what I had done wasn't just an act of refusal. It was an act of legacy. Not the kind written into a will, but the kind passed on in the way you live, the values you show without shouting. The morning after I published my post, I woke early, not from restlessness or excitement, but from a strange inner quiet. The house felt still in a way that was almost unfamiliar. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't weigh heavy on me. I made tea without checking my phone, trying to hold on to that feeling a little longer. But when I finally glanced at the screen, it was flooded. Messages from friends, acquaintances, even strangers. I stared in disbelief as the notifications kept appearing, each one carrying a different tone but echoing a shared response. They'd read my words, and something had shifted inside them too. I had not expected that. I wrote the post not to be seen but to release something I had kept in silence for years. Somehow, what I said resonated beyond my small world. People wrote to say thank you, to share their own family wounds, to admit how often they had dismissed or misunderstood the quiet elders in their lives. I read those messages slowly, some with tears, some with a smile that stayed long after the screen dimmed. It was as if, by telling my truth, I had unlocked a door others were standing behind. That afternoon, Keith arrived without warning, practically bursting with energy. He'd seen the story spreading online, shared by bloggers, reposted in family forums, mentioned in online communities for older adults. "You've touched people, Grandma," he told me, beaming like someone watching a small miracle unfold. I nodded, not sure what to say. I hadn't meant to start anything, and yet here it was, something that had grown from pain and turned into connection. That night, the house returned to stillness, but it felt different, lighter. I sat by the window and stared at the branches swaying in the dusk. In the quiet, I could finally hear my own thoughts again. I had been so many things over the years: wife, mother, caregiver, widow, and somewhere along the way, I stopped believing I could be anything else. But now I'd found a voice that wasn't rooted in sacrifice or duty, it was just mine. The messages kept coming. One was from a woman in Oregon who said she hadn't spoken to her elderly mother in over a decade and now felt moved to call. Another came from a man in his 30s who said he understood finally why his grandmother had seemed so sad at holidays. Some messages were short and tentative, others long and deeply personal. I answered many, and the ones I couldn't reply to, I held close in my heart. They reminded me that pain doesn't isolate us the way we think it does. More often, it links us. I kept writing, not about Jenny or Gavin directly, but about what their actions had revealed. I wrote about aging, about being pushed to the sidelines in your own family story. I wrote about invisibility and how easily people forget the hands that once held everything together. I wrote not to accuse, but to reflect, and somehow, that honesty kept drawing people in. Keith helped me rename the blog. He called it Still Here. At first I laughed, but as the days went on, the name grew on me. It wasn't loud or proud, it simply stated a fact. Still here, still standing, still thinking, feeling, learning. That small phrase became a quiet declaration of presence, one I hadn't known I needed. Gavin remained silent. I hadn't heard from him since the wedding. No apology, no confrontation, just absence. Keith gave me small updates, more out of care than obligation. The honeymoon was canceled, the venue still demanding payment, finances tight. But I no longer felt guilty. I didn't gloat either. It just no longer felt like my responsibility. That door had closed, not with anger, but with finality. One morning, as I stood on the balcony watering the herbs Keith helped me pot, I began to hum. It was a tune I didn't recognize, soft and simple, but it stayed with me all day. I moved slowly, deliberately, and for the first time in years, I felt at ease in my own skin. Nothing dramatic had happened. I hadn't won or lost anything, but the burden I used to carry of proving my worth, of asking to be included, was simply gone. A few days later, a local magazine editor reached out. She'd read my blog and asked if I'd be willing to contribute to a column called Voices from Experience. I hesitated at first. I hadn't written for visibility, but I remembered the messages, the stories that had poured in, and I realized how many people longed to feel seen. So I said yes. I wasn't writing to justify anymore. I wasn't hoping to be forgiven or to explain the past. I was simply telling the truth, and that had become enough. Each word I typed reminded me of who I was: quiet, steady, and finally free to take up space without apology. By the time fall arrived, I had settled into a rhythm that no longer revolved around anticipation. No waiting for Gavin's calls, no checking the mailbox hoping for a note of apology, no scanning old photos for signs of a son I thought I still recognized. I spent my mornings writing by the window, my afternoons answering letters from readers, and my evenings walking with Doris or reading aloud to myself when the light softened across the floorboards. I never imagined a life without constant emotional negotiation could feel so full, but it did. Not loud or showy, just honest. One crisp afternoon, I opened an envelope that stood out from the usual stack. The return address wasn't familiar, but the handwriting was unmistakably Gavin's. Inside was a brief note, awkwardly phrased, scribbled on a sheet of plain-lined paper. It didn't offer apology, not truly, but it hinted at regret, at confusion. He said he'd read something someone had shared, likely the blog, and that it had made him think. That was it. No request, no demand, just that single murky acknowledgement. I didn't answer, not because I was angry, but because I had nothing left to offer that would fit into the shape of that kind of exchange. I didn't want a half-hearted reattachment. What I wanted, what I needed, was never about being right. It was about being treated like a person again. That required more than a scribbled sentence. Keith visited that weekend carrying groceries and an overstuffed backpack of books I hadn't asked for but would gladly read. Over tea, I mentioned the note. He didn't say much at first, just nodded and looked out the window. Eventually, he said, "I think he's trying, in the only way he knows how." "Maybe," I replied, "but I'm not trying anymore, Keith. I've already arrived." He smiled then, not with pity or sadness, but with a kind of proud affection that said he understood exactly what I meant. And maybe that was enough. I no longer needed the validation from the person who once held my heart captive. I had it from the one who saw it freely beating. Later that week, Doris and I sat in the little cafe where the waitress knew our names and never hurried us out. We talked about small things, the late bloom of her hydrangeas, the bus driver who always whistled Sinatra, the ridiculousness of fashion these days. But underneath it, I sensed she knew I was carrying something. She didn't push, she simply listened when I was ready to speak. "I got a letter from my son," I said, stirring my tea slowly. "It was not much, but it was something." "Do you want it to mean something?" she asked gently. I thought for a moment. I wanted to mean that I can move forward without waiting. And I did. That night, I boxed up the few remaining items that tied me to the house I used to share with Gavin. Photographs, little souvenirs from trips long past, birthday cards I had kept more out of habit than love. I wasn't throwing them away, just putting them somewhere that wasn't in plain sight. I needed space for what was still to come. The library invited me to lead a community talk, just a casual evening of tea and stories open to anyone interested in discussing the later seasons of life. I hesitated, unsure whether people would want to hear more from someone like me. But Keith encouraged me, and Doris offered to sit in the front row, armed with smiles and reassurance. That evening, I wore a soft gray sweater and the amethyst necklace Keith had given me for my birthday. The room was small but full. There were women my age, men with folded arms and open eyes, a few younger people sitting cautiously in the back. I didn't read a speech. I just talked about aging, about respect, about how easily the contributions of women like me get tucked behind closed doors until someone needs a check or a casserole. When I finished, there was a long silence before the first applause. Then more. Then people approached me one by one to say thank you, not because I had said anything revolutionary, but because I had said what they had long felt and hadn't known how to name. That night, I walked home under a clear sky, the stars bright and undistracted. The chill in the air made me zip my coat all the way up, but I felt warm inside. I was not invisible. Not anymore, and perhaps the greatest victory wasn't in changing Gavin's mind or Jenny's attitude. It wasn't in exposing what they'd done or forcing an apology. It was in reclaiming my place in the world, not as someone's mother, not as a funding source, not as a shadow in the background, but as myself, fully present, fully enough. After the talk at the library, something shifted inside me. Not dramatically, not like a door slamming open, but more like a curtain being drawn aside. I realized I had stopped measuring my life in terms of what had been lost or denied. Instead, I had begun to value what remained, what was still unfolding with quiet dignity. The act of speaking publicly, of owning my story without apology, had left a lasting calm in its wake. In the days that followed, I noticed a change in how people treated me around town. The woman at the florist greeted me by name and asked about my lavender blog. The pharmacist mentioned how her mother had been moved by what I'd said during the library evening. A teenager even recognized me in the cafe, saying his grandmother had shared my post about late-life friendships. None of it went to my head. I wasn't chasing notoriety. but it warmed something in me that had long gone cold. One afternoon, while watering the balcony plants, I received an unexpected visit. It wasn't Gavin or Jenny, I didn't expect them anymore, but Robert. He showed up with a small bag of groceries and a gentle smile, like he knew I wouldn't have asked but might appreciate the gesture all the same. We sat at my kitchen table, drinking chamomile tea and talking about nothing urgent. The early signs of autumn, a concert at the community center, his daughter's upcoming move. At one point, he reached across the table and touched my hand. It was a simple gesture, unhurried, steady. I didn't flinch or pull away. I met his gaze and nodded slightly, letting him know without words that I was open to where this was going, not rushing into declarations or dramatic turns, but quietly sharing what time we had. He asked me if I'd like to visit the coastal village again, maybe stay for a long weekend this time. The idea didn't frighten me. In fact, it felt like something I'd earned, not as a reward, but as a right. A choice I could make freely, not in reaction to someone else's chaos. We agreed on a weekend in October, when the leaves would be turning and the sea would have that gray-blue stillness I remembered from spring. I started to look forward to it, not as an escape, but as a continuation of the life I had slowly reclaimed. That evening, I received another message from Gavin. It was short, but more composed than his last one. He said things at home had been difficult, that Jenny was still upset about the fallout from the wedding, and that he didn't know how to fix it all. He didn't mention money. He didn't ask for anything. Just ended the message with, "I miss you. I don't know how to say it right, but I do." I stared at those words for a long time. Once I would have replied immediately, rushing to fill the silence with reassurance, trying to fix things that had never been mine to fix. But now, I took a breath and set the phone down. I didn't need to answer right away. Maybe not at all. The thing is, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even particularly hurt. I simply understood that love, when tangled in manipulation and silence, becomes a kind of burden. I had spent so many years trying to carry it for both of us, and I was finally putting it down. That night, I slept with the windows open, the cool breeze drifting across the room. In my dream, I stood on the shoreline, watching the tide move in and out. I wasn't waiting for anything. I was simply there, present and whole. I didn't realize how much had changed until one quiet morning when I watched Robert watering the balcony plants. He moved with a kind of quiet precision, the way he shifted pots, checked the soil, tilted leaves toward the light. It made me think of gentleness, something I thought had vanished with time. We'd been home from the coast for several days, yet something between us had settled, quiet and calm, like a soft breath drawn after years of holding one in. We never spoke of moving in together or drawing up plans. That was never how we worked. Instead, there was comfort in small things. Him remembering how I liked my tea, me knowing which shoulder his jacket always slipped from. There was room for both of us to be exactly who we were, no reshaping, no performing. Keith still visited often, filling our space with stories and energy. He'd tease me about my blog, which had somehow gained more followers than I ever imagined, or poke fun at Robert for sneaking away with another plant cutting each week. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he'd ask if I'd heard from Gavin, and every time I'd answer truthfully. I hadn't, and I no longer hoped to. It no longer ached the way it used to. That pain had dulled into something quieter, something I could live with. There were no apologies left unsaid, no final letters waiting to be written. I had spoken all I needed to speak the moment I chose to stand alone with dignity. One evening, as golden light spilled through the living room, Robert and I sat together, my knitting resting in my lap, his hand warm around a mug of coffee. We didn't speak much, but we didn't have to. There was peace in that silence, the kind that doesn't ask for more. Beyond our window, the world moved on. Cars passed, streetlights flickered on, lives unfolded. But in here, I had stopped waiting for the next disappointment, the next justification, the next silent withdrawal of love. I no longer needed to ask who noticed when I watered my plants. I no longer wrote my blog with a shrinking voice. I no longer made plans while holding my breath. And when Keith looked at me and said, "Grandma, you seem more like yourself than ever," I finally understood what he meant. This stillness had taken time. It didn't arrive all at once. It came in steps, through hurt, through honesty, through choosing again and again to protect my peace. I couldn't undo the chapters already written, but I no longer wished to. They had brought me here. The air outside had grown cooler, the scent of fall already rising from the ground. I knew seasons would turn, life would keep changing. But for now, the light coming through my window was warm, and Robert's shoulder rested gently against mine. I leaned into that moment, knowing this quiet, unremarkable evening was the one I wanted to remember.